prevalence of single-parent families, especially Black single-mother families, is a complex issue influenced by socio-economic factors, low marriage rates, and historical context, but also by individual choices and circumstances, which altogether stems as well from societal pressure, as every fruit has a root, and every symptom has a cause. From 1995 to 2018, single-mother prevalence remained highest among Black children, followed by Latino children, and then by white children. This prevalence in the 1995 to 2018 pooled samples are as follows: Blacks, 45.2%, Latinos, 21.8%, and whites, 13.6%. To better understand the rise of single-parent households in the Black community, it is essential for us to have a deeper look at some key socio-economic factors, such as the historical, economic, and cultural contexts that certainly have contributed to this trend. Number 1. Poverty and inequality. Black communities often face higher rates of poverty and economic hardship, which can impact family stability and lead to challenges in maintaining two-parent households. Conversations about inner-city Black communities like Chicago often devolve into blaming single Black mothers for having multiple kids on welfare, obviously giving a blind eye to the grave causes of poverty and inequality manufacturing such unrelenting outcomes. This shift in family structure has profound implications, as approximately 67% of African American youth live in single-parent households, which has been linked to an increased risk of internalizing and externalizing problematic behaviors, which, in turn, continues to orbit them about that dark cycle of uncare, abandon, life of violence, and increasing poverty. Number 2. Education and employment. Access to education and employment opportunities can influence decisions about marriage and family formation. Economic instability can lead to higher rates of single motherhood. Many Black families face systemic barriers to employment and wealth accumulation, which can impact family dynamics. Economic hardship can also increase the likelihood of non-marital childbearing. Number 3. Historical context. The legacy of slavery and racial discrimination has contributed immensely to the challenges faced by Black families, including the disruption of family structures. Many notable African American figures throughout history, like Earl Little, father of Malcolm X, who died while tied to rail tracks, and Emmett Till, whose father Lewis Till was lynched while serving in the U.S. Army, were raised by single mothers with the help of family and friends as a result of their father being assassinated. This helped to normalize within the culture to not blame or ostracize the woman for being a single mother. This breakdown of social norms had a significant impact on the acceptability of out-of-wedlock childbirth. Before we continue with even more interesting details on the sad, unrelenting causes and state of single Black parents in the U.S., don't forget to support our work by hitting the thumb button of this video. Endeavor to share with friends and families to keep spreading our eye-opening Black narrative, and subscribe to stay tuned in with us. Now, let's get back on the road. In the United States, more than 20 million live in a home without the physical presence of a father. Millions more have dads who are physically present but emotionally absent. If it were classified as a disease, fatherlessness would be an epidemic worthy of attention as a national emergency. As of 2012, a research on family structure and children's living arrangements by Census Bureau uncovered, according to race, percentages of children who are living absent their biological fathers. Whites had the lowest percentage of 20.7% of fatherless children, Hispanic was 31.2%, and the highest on the data were Blacks, with 57.6% of Black children without fatherhood in their lives. 71% of all high school dropouts come from fatherless homes. 71% of all pregnant teenagers, 85% of all children with behavior disorders, 90% of all homeless and runaway children, all come from fatherless homes, and they are mostly Blacks. 63% of youth suicides are from fatherless homes. 85% of all youths in prison come from fatherless homes. You just hear it yourself.
Do you think a father missing in the home is a problem? Or do you think it's not? there's a balance. But if the father's missing, I'm gonna give you some stats. Not coming from me. I'm gonna give them to you. I wanna read them to you. 63% of youth suicide are from fatherless homes. 63%. 80% of rapists with anger problems comes from fatherless homes. Children with fathers who are involved, now check this out, 70% are less likely to drop out of school. 70% of fathers that's involved are less likely to drop out of school. Now look at this one. 75% of all adolescent patients in chemical abuse centers are from fatherless homes. 75%. Hold on to your hat. I got some more. I know you're sweating right now because you don't want to hear these, but I'm gonna give them to you. Daughters of single parents without a father involved are 53% more likely to marry as teenagers. 711%, that's right. Look at it, 711% are more likely to have children as teenagers, and 164% more likely to have a premarital relationship, and 92% more likely to get divorced even if they do get married. 90% of homeless and runaway children are from fatherless homes. Is that enough to make you up? I'm not through yet. 71% of pregnant teenagers lack a father.
The sad list is endless, and sadder still is, they are mostly blacks. Now let's go down to the roots. From the initial involuntary migration of African Americans to the United States, an ad hoc family structure, assembled based on enslaved people that lived in proximity to one another, and changed and adjusted as enslaved persons were sold, died prematurely, or disconnected in some other manner, creating more emphasis on the extended family and non-biological connectedness of people, as opposed to formalized titles and relationships. The continued need for extended non-biological family continued throughout Reconstruction and Jim Crow because of the prevalence at which nuclear families were disrupted because of premature death, primarily of fathers, grandfathers, and other male figureheads. The family structure of African Americans has long been a matter of national public policy interest. A 1965 report by Daniel Patrick Moynihan, known as the Moynihan Report, examined the link between black poverty and family structure. It hypothesized that the destruction of the black nuclear family structure would hinder further progress toward economic and political equality. Due to the unique and devastating migratory method by which African Americans were introduced into the Americas, through the transatlantic slave trade, many people arrived not as intact families, but as individuals forcibly separated from their families. Slaves were denied marriage. This violent displacement disrupted traditional African family structures, creating a legacy of fragmented families and community ties that would shape the African American experience for centuries. As a result, the evolution of African American family structure must be understood in distinct periods, each reflecting the impact of slavery, emancipation, and systemic racial oppression. White sugar planters opted to enhance their profits by consistently favoring a male labor force, a strategy that necessitated the systematic importation of male slaves. This approach resulted in significant demographic and social ramifications, including the prevalence of matrifocal family structures, enforced celibacy among men, early widowhood for women, and the absence of fathers in the lives of children. These effects are thought to have influenced family dynamics over the long term. The conditions of slavery and the enforced celibacy in the United States, where men struggled to find partners in predominantly male environments, have been associated with a rise in the prevalence of single-mother households. Additionally, the higher incidence of extended families among African Americans can be traced back to the vulnerabilities imposed on the nuclear family structure by slavery. Let us briefly examine how African American families adapted, survived, and evolved over time in response to these external pressures. From 1650 to 1700, African family structures were heavily fragmented by the transatlantic slave trade and early colonial slavery. From 1700 to 1750, codified laws institutionalized matrilineal slavery, further disrupting African American family bonds. From 1750 to 1800, enslaved communities developed extended kinship networks and fictive kin structures in response to family separations. From 1800 to 1850, the domestic slave trade caused widespread family disintegration, but informal family bonds persisted. From 1850 to 1900. After emancipation, African Americans worked to reunite families and formalize marriages, but the ongoing economic and social challenges persisted. The breakdown of the black family was first brought to national attention in 1965 by sociologist and later Democratic Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan in the groundbreaking Moynihan Report, also known as The Negro Family: The Case for National Action. Moynihan's report made the argument that the relative absence of nuclear families in Black America would greatly hinder further Black socio-economic progress. When Moynihan warned in his 1965 report on the coming destruction of the Black family, however, the out-of-wedlock birth rate had increased to 25% among the Black population. This figure continued to rise over time, and in 1991, 68% of Black children were born outside of marriage. U.S. Census data from 2010 reveal that more African American families consisted of single mothers than married households with both parents. In 2011, it was reported that 72% of Black babies were born to unmarried mothers. As of 2015, at 77.3%, Black Americans have the highest rate of non-marital births among native-born Americans. Compared to white women, Black women were more likely to become teenage mothers, stay single, and have marriage instability, and were thus much more likely to live in female-headed single-parent homes. This pattern has been known as Black matriarchy because of the observance of many households headed by women. This is how down the lane the unfortunate history of suffering and displacement has driven Black families over the edge into single parenting today. According to the recent U.S. Census, approximately 19.4 million parents in the U.S. are raising children without a partner, with a disproportionate 15.4 million being single mothers. This demographic faces significant economic challenges, with around 30% of single-parent households living below the poverty line as of 2021. In stark contrast, only 6% of two-parent households face similar economic struggles. Alarmingly, the number of single parents living in poverty is rising rapidly, with vast numbers of Black single mothers being very much affected. By the mid-20th century, the United States started experiencing a significant shift in family dynamics. Until the 1940s and 1950s, divorce rates remained relatively low, with around 10 to 15% of marriages ending in divorce. Single-parent households were also relatively rare, making up around 5 to 10% of all households. However, this began to change in the 1960s and 1970s. Divorce rates started to rise, reaching around 25 to 30% by the end of the 1970s. Single-parent households also became more common, increasing to around 20 to 25% of all households. Among African American women, marriage rates were relatively high until the 1980s. In fact, marriages among African American women exceeded those of unmarried African American women. However, after the 1980s, marriage rates among African American women dropped drastically, with slavery being a major factor. Slavery in America had traumatized and devastated millions of people, husbands and wives, parents and children, as they could not protect themselves from being sold away from each other. Enslaved families were separated at an owner's or auctioneer's whim, never to see each other again. The domestic slave trade separated nearly half of all enslaved people from their spouses and parents. Most of the men were stripped away from their families after impregnating women to breed more generations of children who would be raised to be slaves and continue the cycle. African Americans were only allowed to marry when permitted by the white slaver. It was called shacking up, a term which is still used in today's world to describe two people living together as spouses who aren't married. Slave owners didn't support slave relationships out of kindness. Instead, they saw it as a way to get richer by having more slaves. They wanted slaves to have children, which would give them more workers and more wealth. Slave owners didn't recognize slave marriages as real. They called them quasi-marriages, implying they were fake. This was hypocritical, as it went against Christian teachings. The institution of slavery stripped away the roles of black men as providers and caretakers, disrupting the natural family dynamics. As a result, the psychological effects of this historical trauma have been passed down through generations, leading to a pervasive narrative that it's normal for black men to be absent from their families. Today, about 98% black men have a biased view of beauty, favoring light-skinned women over darker-skinned ones. This colorism is a leftover mentality from slavery, where the white class saw light-skinned individuals as more desirable and adorable. A disturbing example of this is when a black man in Barbados called a dark-skinned woman a derogatory name, despite being darker himself. This kind of thinking is not only hurtful, but also perpetuates a cycle of self-hatred. On the other hand, the mindset of prioritizing material success over family and responsibility affects not just relationships, but also family dynamics. This stems from the legacy of slavery, where black men were forced to abandon their children born to slave masters. Today, this mentality persists, leading some men to abandon their families and prioritize getting money, looking successful, and advancing in life, even if it means leaving their loved ones behind. As a result, sons would grow up thinking it's acceptable to walk away from their responsibilities, while daughters would engage with irresponsible men who don't value commitment or family. This cycle is hard to break, especially since it has been passed down through generations. Consequently, many people struggle to see the importance of marriage or family because they didn't grow up with those values. With the marriage rate of African Americans being higher than that of whites in the 70s, and later dropping drastically in the 80s, making the marriage rates of whites higher, one begins to ponder, what really happened? The crack epidemic and subsequent war on drugs criminalized the pool of eligible men. Since the CIA planted drugs in black communities and the government took jobs out, the hood had become spawned around the 1980s. Prior to that, these communities were just poor ghetto areas. The hood culture, pushed on the black community, largely by the CIA and the music industry, diverted their attention from family-oriented values to a more selfish and individualistic mindset. This shift forced men and women to adopt the triumphant individual cultural narrative, which ultimately divided them as people became increasingly selfish. The original culture of black people had begun to shift, largely due to the media's influence, towards a culture that prioritizes sex, money, and murder. The hood culture took this to the extreme, where young men would often embrace a toxic mentality that encourages them to have multiple sexual partners, and when a girl becomes pregnant, she is often left to deal with the consequences alone. The hood culture destroyed the black community, promoting destructive behaviors that have ravaged individuals and families from all angles. This toxic culture objectified and degraded black women, reduced black men to incarceration or exploitation, and perpetuated cycles of violence, including the harming of their own children. Furthermore, the culture inflicted profound harm on the community's well-being, spreading drug addiction, mental health issues, and alcoholism, which have led to long-term health problems. By prioritizing material wealth over spiritual values and human relationships, this culture eroded solidarity and promoted a self-destructive emphasis on sex, money, and violence. Worst of all, this culture glamorized murder and gang violence, deceiving many into believing that breaking the law is the only means of reclaiming their independence. The opioid crisis has devastated rural areas, disproportionately affecting African American men who struggle with addiction. This has led to a cycle of incarceration and tragedy, with some losing their lives to overdose and others being sent to prison. The ripple effects of this crisis are wreaking havoc on families and communities, causing a breakdown in family structures and perpetuating a cycle of instability. As a result, fewer marriages and more single-parent households, with more children growing up without stable father figures, begins to emerge. This cycle has further led to instability and dysfunction, where future generations don't see healthy, stable relationships modeled for them. This is quite similar to what happened in some African American communities during the crack epidemic, where many black men were incarcerated, leading to a breakdown in family structures and a lack of stable relationships. Black Americans, like any other race, dream of experiencing the material comforts of America, from which they have been largely excluded throughout their entire history in the country. Financial harmony is crucial to any relationship, regardless of the couple's color. Since many Black Americans struggle to provide for their families financially, their relationships are more likely to face challenges. In the Moynihan Report, a document which focused on the relationship between unemployment, family instability, and the intergenerational transmission of poverty in the Black race, the writer had further warned that because of the structural absence of employment in the ghetto, the Black family was disintegrating and would, in a way that would destroy the fabric of community life for them. The intense bias in the legal system against minorities is another issue of concern. An innocent Black father can just suddenly get arrested on a good day on dubious charges because he fits the description of some suspect of a real or imagined crime that the cops claim occurred. Even if such a Black father can get the charges dropped, getting his life back in order and getting back to being a responsible father will not be easy with a damaging arrest now on his record. In some cases, some have been vindicated from such strokes of racial bias and misfortune, while in other cases, innocent Black persons have suffered all through their lives, or worse even, been killed for crimes they know nothing about, thereby giving rise to even more and more single parenting in Black communities. Going forward, discrimination in terms of employment most times hurts the confidence of Black Americans in providing for their families, especially the men. Despite having equal or better qualifications in most cases, that they are still often less likely to be hired than their white counterparts is psychologically displacing. The unending recurrence of such unfair treatment does create in our Black figures nothing other than low self-esteem, and thus often makes them doubt their ability to take care of a home. But that's not all here. In some cases, just when most of these Blacks would try to persevere, still, in the middle of such traumatizing displeasure, they end up being faced with other challenges, such as living in areas with underfunded schools that provide substandard education for their kids. This realization can be devastating, leading some to consider a drastic measure: divorcing their wives so that their children can receive welfare benefits and have a better life. The decline of the Black family unit is often attributed to the welfare state, but in reality, it is the lack of tangible opportunities for jobs, growth, and economic mobility that glaringly appears to be the root cause. Systemic and institutional racism, including discriminatory housing practices, have severely limited access to resources and opportunities for struggling Black families. The welfare state has inadvertently contributed to the decline by providing financial incentives which encourage single-parent households, leading to a lack of personal responsibility as individuals rely on the government for support. As a result, marriage has become less and less attractive, whereby many couples can't tell if they would ever get to tie the knot someday, even if they would love to when asked, but not any time in the near future. This has perpetuated fatherlessness, leaving children without a stable male presence in their lives. The consequences are devastating, as high rates of single parenthood, lower marriage rates, and increased poverty ravage all through African American communities. In essence, the welfare state's well-intentioned but misguided policies have undermined the traditional family structure, leaving a trail of broken families and shattered dreams in its wake. Systemic racism and discrimination are some other significant contributors to the growing number of single Black mothers. A poignant example of this is when an interracial couple faces rejection due to racial prejudices. Consider a scenario where a Black woman and her partner from a different racial background are in a loving relationship. When she becomes pregnant, her partner's family rejects her solely because of her race. To avoid familial conflict, the partner ends the relationship and urges her to terminate the pregnancy. However, the woman, aware of the dangers of abortion, decides to keep the baby. And just like that, another single mother has been added to the list. This heart-wrenching situation exemplifies how systemic racism can lead to family fragmentation, leaving Black women to raise children alone. The trauma and stigma resulting from such experiences can have long-lasting effects on these women and their children. In fact, research shows that the U.S. has the highest share of children living in single-parent households, with Black single mothers making up 80% of these households. While data indicates that 51% of single mothers have never been married and 29% are divorced, they do not reflect how many parents made the decision to start a family on their own. The issue of single parenthood affects both Black and white communities. However, the focus on African American women stems from the unique challenges they face due to systemic racism and bias. It's the same reason why 2 Black men were arrested at Starbucks for simply sitting there, or why a Black Yale student was reported to the police for sleeping in her dorm's common area. Even celebrities like Chris Rock have been stopped by police without cause. NBA legend Isaiah Thomas felt compelled to sell his luxury car and replace it with a more modest vehicle to avoid unwanted police attention. These incidents illustrate the persistent racial profiling and discrimination that African Americans encounter daily. This biased treatment perpetuates disparities in education, employment, housing, and healthcare, ultimately affecting family structures and relationships. In closing, African American women are more likely to face single parenthood due to the unfair obstacles they encounter in society. These challenges are not solely personal issues, but symptoms of a broader societal problem. Today, the United States continues to grapple with the complexities of family dynamics, including the rise of single parenthood and the decline of marriage rates among certain populations. As we peel back the layers of societal expectations, economic realities, and personal resilience, we find a powerful narrative emerging, one of hope, determination, and unwavering love. The rise of single Black parenting is more than a statistic. It's a testament to the unbreakable bonds between parents and children, and a reflection of the community's capacity to adapt, overcome, and thrive. As we move forward, let us celebrate the strength and beauty of these families and work towards creating a society that uplifts, supports, and empowers them to reach their full potential. Now, that brings us to the end of yet another informative video from Black Journals. We thank you for joining us all through this journey. Don't forget to support our works by always hitting the thumb up button before you. Share video with as many as you possibly can to keep spreading our eye-opening Black narrative, and subscribe to Stay Tuned In if you are yet to do so. Your support means a great deal to us. Thank you for hanging in there. See you in the next one.